Cool, man. It's been a while.
Yeah, yeah. About a month, man.
That's crazy. Well, we summer is always funny, right? You think it's going to be like relaxed, and then it's like there's stuff going on all the time. But I was in Canada last week. That was just last week, right? Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah.
And went there for the first in-person Tailwind event, which was super fun. Um, from that should be coming up pretty soon. We'll include it in like the Build UI newsletter. I think it'd be fun to add it there. And yeah, had a great time. It was pretty awesome.
Cool. Do you want to like recap it? Like, what, just a quick little recap.
Yeah, my talk was really just showing off some new CSS features that you can do with Tailwind, both because Tailwind added some utilities for things like text accent, and even like I guess the masonry was an arbitrary value, but just showing off kind of like things that you might not know you can do, with just CSS in 2023. And then also talking about how part of the philosophy of Tailwind is like not putting you in guardrails, not no child restraints in a sense. Like it's a really powerful tool, and Adam stressed in the keynote is always part of his goal to make sure that people could build any custom design with Tailwind. And if you ever felt like Tailwind was getting to a point where you couldn't build what you wanted to with it, then it's like he wouldn't be interested in the project anymore. And so we did like a new masonry grid layout, which is like only supported in Firefox right now, but is super cool.
Is
It's like
that
a
it?
grid
Is that like with like the CSS grid?
feature CSS grid. Yep. It's pretty incredible actually, because the example we originally pulled was from Tailwind, one of the Tailwind UI components. And if you look at the markup needed to get it, you had to have like, it was like a 4-column masonry thing, and you had to have like a grid with 3 columns, and then each column had to have its own individual thing that were like grids inside of it or something. And this one is just all the cards are siblings. It's just like a loop. Each
Wow.
testimonial render a div, and then 4-column grid in the parent, and then template rows masonry. Boom, they all snap up. So that was pretty fun.
Very cool.
Yeah. But the whole keynote will be out pretty soon. So yeah, there was some really exciting stuff in there. So maybe we'll talk more about that when it comes out, and we can share it in the notes.
Cool.
Sweet. Cool. So today we have a few topics we want to talk about. We want to talk about TypeScript and data loading. And I think we also want to talk about this data fetching stuff with the server actions that you were kind of mentioning earlier this week. So I'll start with this TypeScript bit. This came from some work I was doing. I think it was on Build UI actually. I was adding a feature, and we did Ember work for a long time, and we had this library that we used to help make sure you had the data loaded by the time the page rendered. So this was a problem that came up in SPA development, because a lot of times when you're building SPAs, you have different ways to arrive at a page, and you usually have a client-side cache. So the combination of those two problems can lead to a situation where, let's say you've loaded an index page of blog posts, and the index page only has the title and description. And then you click on a blog post and you go to the detail page, and the detail page needs to fetch everything. So on the detail page, you need to fetch the title, description, and the whole contents. And in older versions of Ember Data, there was, and maybe even in the current version, but when we worked on it, there was no notion of like whether a record was fully loaded. So maybe for the route on the detail page, when you load it up, you define your data query there in the model hook for the router, which would be like get server-side props and next, let's say. And you say, I have to load the title, description, and the contents. But because there was a cache, sometimes the behavior would be, well, we've already loaded blog post 1 if we're coming from the index route. And when we click on it and navigate to the detail page, Ember already thought that blog post 1 was kind of in the client-side store, as it was called. And so it would render it immediately with the title and description, and then in the background, trigger the reload for the detail page, and then the contents would actually like pop in afterwards. So you'd have some like layout shifts, some folk. And so we had developed this kind of library that you could use to drop in the detail page if you wanted to avoid this kind of behavior from happening. And it was called like assert must preload. It was a feature of like a data fetching kind of add-on that we had worked on called Ember Data Storefront. Anyways, you could put in your template that you must have the title, description, and contents preloaded before the page renders. And if not, you would get an error. And it was like a, do you remember if it was like a dev time error or a runtime? I think it was a runtime error, but it was for
Runtime,
like the
yeah.
development mode.
Right.
Yeah, so it was a runtime error, but it was supposed to happen during development mode, so you could see, and it could be brought to the developer's attention. Hey, you didn't think about this particular path through your app and how you could arrive here with the store only partially loaded. And I was working on Build UI, and we have GraphQL with like code gen set up. So we have our GraphQL queries, which power the page. Code gen then runs every time you create or update like a GraphQL query. And so when you're rendering data in the template in the JSX, you're working with typed data from the query, and if you're missing a property or not. And it just made me realize that it's so cool that you can get that at a typing level, that feedback before even knowing, because we wouldn't have even thought how to do that at the typing level, at the static compile time checking back then when we were working on Ember apps.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It wasn't
And
obvious.
well, I don't even think it was possible because a lot of this is driven by like Ember. A lot of Ember was driven by handlebars in your templating language. We didn't use TypeScript with Ember. I know it's possible, but at the time we didn't.
Yeah.
So yeah, the TypeScript feedback is really good, and it's really good that you don't actually have to run the code. So one of the things about assert must preload, it was a runtime check. So you actually had to click through all the paths to get to that blog post page to make sure that they all had loaded the content. And we would accomplish this by writing tests. So like we would have a test that went to like the about page first, and then went to the blog post page, went to the index page,
exactly.
went to the blog post page. But one of the cool things about TypeScript is you can do it all at compile time, so you don't have to run the app. You just get feedback. You get the feedback before you write a test, which is a lot nicer because there's a lot less work involved for you as a developer.
Yep. I was trying to think if this was ever an issue in Rails, in like a traditional server rendered app where you try to render something that you forget to load, and you don't get feedback until you actually go through that runtime path.
Yeah. It definitely was, because you could trigger n+1s. So in Rails, you could say, fetch me all the blog posts and include all the comments and the authors, and then you hand that off to the template, and the template can just have nested loops. It iterates over all posts, all comments, all authors. But if you only fetch the posts and you don't include the comments and authors, then Rails will still iterate over that. But as it goes to iterate over the comments, it will say like, I haven't fetched these comments yet. Let me go make a database query for them. And that's why
it'll fetch them on your behalf.
Yeah. Yep. And so you don't, it's nice from I didn't have to think about this. But then as your database grows, it does have like a big performance impact. There is a gem in Rails, I think it's called Bullet, something like that puts guards, basically monkey patches active record objects and puts guards, and says if you try to access a record that hasn't been loaded, it'll throw an error. But similar to the Ember stuff, it was a runtime check. So you wouldn't get that feedback at build time or compile time. Well, I guess you're not really compiling.
You're not really compiling. It's pretty amazing though that types. It's pretty amazing that types can obviate this entire problem though.
Yeah.
It's not an obvious solution to the problem of making sure you've loaded the right data. Is to connect types from your queries to the page where they're being rendered.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair.
But now it is, like in retrospect, it is. And then with server components, it's even better because you don't have the network boundary, so you don't have the possibility of the errors there. Because if you're doing client-side rendering, but you're fetching data in like get server side props, your tooling will tell you that this query, like the data for the page is typed a certain way, but it could actually be something else just because the network is always a runtime question. So that's where something like Zod comes in, right? But at least as a developer, you haven't made a mistake. But it's even more like airtight from the perspective of a server component because I think the ideal when you think about TypeScript and what it's trying to help you do, right? It's helping you avoid programming errors, but there's the ideal world is where there's no runtime behavior that's not accounted for by the types in your system. So if your types check, if your types check, then you haven't thought of a path. There's not a path that you haven't thought of in your application. This is like the strongly typed languages like Haskell and Elm. That's the whole part of the whole point of that really strict type safety is once your program compiles, there's no possibility for a runtime error. That's like the extreme version of this. And so there's still some areas in the tools that we use where you kind of wave your hands, maybe you add a type and it's not really the type, like, infer gets server side props. If it doesn't say, it could also be anything else because your server could just return anything. Someone could make a change to your API route. And now your program at runtime doesn't actually line up with the types. But it's a step in the right direction. And then the server component data fetching story is so great because it actually is. If the return type from Prisma is accurate, which it is, because you're relying on the library to do that, you have to account for every possible return value from the database, and that's all running in the same environment. So you've accounted for every runtime flow of the program, and so it can't error.
I mean, yes, I would say the Prisma stuff is more airtight because it's not a process that we're running. We're like delegating that to Prisma, but it still has the same potential drift in that you can generate your Prisma types, edit your database.
That's true.
And so that's true. That's where
that's true. The database is stateful. So this is like going back to like the Rails and the table. What was the schema file in Rails that could be a lie because a database is stateful, and it's separate from your code base.
But I will say for this discussion, I will say that whether you're using a tool like Prisma or GraphQL CodeGen to generate the types, you end up eliminating like 95% of these. Oh, do I have this data loaded? What is the path? Like where are all the possible places that are loading data and rendering a component? And those tools do an excellent job at solving that. And then when you get into like, I have data from lots of different systems, that data could drift, then you can layer in a tool like Zod to do a runtime check before types are really good for programming. And then runtime check is really good for like actually running your app in prod.
Right.
That makes sense.
And I guess something like the parse, like the JSON parser from Elm would be a similar piece of the puzzle to Zod because that's making sure for Elm to be able to say there's not going to be any runtime errors if your program compiles, that parsing layer has to account for every possible version. So that's why you specify the schema you expect for the JSON response, and if it doesn't adhere to it, you've handled that case. So you could imagine that kind of thing for the Prisma layer as well, where
that's like
this is what the Prisma type says it should be. It could also come back with an error, but it could also come back with data, not an error, but not what you expect because someone changed the database. And you also should account, you could also account for that in your program so that you would never have an unaccounted, like an exception that you didn't think of, in the code.
Very cool. Very cool.
So
the I haven't used the Elm stuff, but it sounds like that has the runtime validation built in. It sounds like it gives you types for the developer, but also has a runtime validation built in.
Yes. Yep. Cool. I think so. I think if you don't get past the parser at run, the type that returns from the data structure you get after parsing the JSON is going to be, one of those three things or whatever. So your code has to account for it, or else it won't compile. So
it's actually kind of interesting because TypeScript just tells you like the types that it infers or that you tell it, but it doesn't actually do a check. So you can lie. We've talked about this before, but you can
You
lie.
can lie, yes.
It would be interesting if there was like a way to type something in TypeScript that also inserted actual JavaScript code when it compiled that said like, if this object doesn't match this shape, then throw an error. So you do get both the developer type system as well as a runtime guarantee. I guess
Yep.
for me, that tool is Zod.
Right.
But I always have to install Zod, reach for it,
Right.
which
It's
I
not
love.
part of
Which
the.
I love. I mean, I
Yeah,
absolutely
I
love.
guess that I think that it makes sense, right? TypeScript is like meeting JavaScript developers where they're at, so it makes sense that it has more flexibility than like another language, and it can't make those hard guarantees out of the box. But I think even if you're a JavaScript developer who's using TypeScript, you know, in your apps the way we are, that's still the mental model that I would say you should take. You should have a mental model that you know the types are there to help you find the runtime bugs. It's like your video on the query params thing, and you want the types to be, yeah, to not be lies because that's the whole point is to avoid the runtime errors. Like
They show
the
you the potential errors. So potential errors
yeah,
are
exactly,
probably
potential errors you hadn't thought of. It's back to this discussion where there's ways through your program that you can't really even think about because there's so many possible states in a piece of software, right? That the types can do so much of that for you. I mean, the autocomplete, all that stuff obviously is important, but that's another important thing. So I think it's especially when we were starting out with TypeScript, but I see it with other folks that we pair with too. That's a point that's sometimes a little nuanced and easy to miss. So I think it's a good way to think about it. If your program type checks and you are running it and testing it and you hit bugs, it would be good to look at your types and make sure they're correct. And you haven't done something like just added a query param type that says search could be a string, because in fact it could be these other things like undefined or an array or whatever. So
right. If you hit a bug and you have to change a type, right. The whole point of TypeScript is to tell you when you have bugs, like when you have potential bugs. Like you didn't think that I have a video that I'm working on. It'll be on YouTube, but I deal with form data, and form data is most of the time when you write a form input, it's going to be a string text area, just a regular text input. But like form inputs can also be files. You can also upload files. So if you ever try to do a string function on form data, TypeScript gets really mad at you because it says, hey, first name could be a file input. And as a developer, it is frustrating because
Right.
you're like, no, first name cannot be a file input. It will
Right.
never be a file input.
Right.
But that's the point of TypeScript. The point of TypeScript is to say, like, potentially you're saying you
Yeah,
accept
and this is
form
back end
data.
code, right?
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
back end code to
It's
handle the
backend code.
submission. So someone could make a request to your your endpoint or to that endpoint with a form, just using some tool, and then your
Yeah, it's
program
true.
would crash, or it wouldn't behave as expected. So that's kind of
But this is the point of TypeScript. It's to highlight those errors. So if you
right.
start changing types without changing code, it's a sign that the type is wrong.
Yes.
Right. You should.
Yes.
If you get a TypeScript error, you should think like, oh, there's a potential path I didn't consider, so therefore I have to
Yes.
update code. If the answer is, oh, this stupid type is off, then it's a problem with your type. That's all.
Yes, that's a great takeaway. If you fell asleep in the last 15 minutes, I think that's the perfect way to summarize this, which is if you have a bug in your program and then you have to go fix it by changing types, it means that's like a problem. Like that shouldn't be the normal flow of things. Usually you want to have the types be, that means your types weren't accurate, and they might not be accurate somewhere else in the program because they weren't accounting for all possible values of a particular piece of state. And so the TypeScript errors should lead you to find a bug in a certain flow, and then you update the code to fix the bug, not the types. So cool. Nice, man. You want to talk about some of your items here?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about. So I've been working much with server actions, which, I love the data fetching side of React server components. So I'm just even more in love with the writing side of server actions. I think they're awesome. If you haven't used them, first I should say they're like very alpha right now. You don't need to rush out and rewrite your apps. I'm only using this in like little demos, little toy projects. But yeah, they're functions that you get to pass to forms. And when React submits a form, it's going to invoke your server action with all the form data from that form on the server. So it's so sweet. No API routes, no like handle submit functions, no boilerplate around submitting forms. Feels just like you're writing a server rendered, PHP Rails app. Anyway, I really like server actions, but one of the things that, as I've been working on them, I kind of realized is that the type of apps that like you and I work on, we don't work on client side only like React apps. We're not the apps that we're working on are like CRUD apps that involve a database, that involve like user login and then a database and displaying data and editing data. We're not like building like canvas based drawing apps that only run client side. And it made me think that like, yeah, these server actions and basically having a way to like get data back to the server and execute it is something that we've always had to deal with. And in every single app, there's like React just says, no, we're like a client side JavaScript library. You get to pick what you do on the server. And you can look at that as like a benefit, like, okay, yeah, I can work with all these different systems. But it kind of sucks that you end up like, yeah, in just every app we work on, there's like, they're all doing the same thing. They're all writing data to a database, but we always end up choosing like different technology. Some of our apps use Prisma, some use Hasura. Yeah, the auth system is always different. And I think one of the things about server actions is like all of that feels like how you talk to your server is now in React. And that'll be like a commonality amongst a whole bunch of apps. And when you kind of have those commonalities, I think that kind of creates a space for make it easier for frameworks to develop. So like as an example here, like just, yeah, some framework can come along and say like, okay, this is how we're going to do forms. And they can provide like a higher level form input that's not just kind of syncing client side React state to a lowercase form element, but more like a form element that gets submitted and then code runs on the server and the server does validation and passes that back to the client. And to my knowledge, nothing like this exists today, but you can see that as React grows to handle these server actions, like this creates room for something like this to exist.
Yeah, a deeper integration. Like the form libraries that exist in React for the last 10 years, like you said, have been concerned with, rendering inputs, handling like blur and focus and change. But once it comes to submit it, you're kind of on your own. Showing pending UI, you're kind of on your own. Refreshing queries that depend on the data that's being mutated, you're on your own. But now, between the server components doing the data fetching within React and the server actions doing the mutation within React, I think you're exactly right. There's a chance for a deeper integration. It would be like Rails giving you a socket connection to a database without giving you active record, because there's no common. There's like no. That's where it would end. That's like been the first 10 years of Rails, where it's like, here's a connection that you can like send commands to and from. But once Rails makes assumptions about how the data lives in the database and how it gets hydrated into Ruby objects, now you have a room for an abstraction that's deeper integrated, something like active record, that knows when to refresh a cached value because of a mutation, that can render validations driven by the backend right into a form. All of those kinds of things that have been missing.
And it creates like a room for like the like community and ecosystem to like flourish. So like with active record, people can build things like, oh, I'm going to build a whole taggable system. You just
Right.
install my library and I know that you're using active record, so I can like start tagging things. I can store tags about things, and all these things exist, like, taggable history for records. All that exists because active record sort of gives a foundation, the commonalities that these libraries, plugins can build on top of. And I think the thing that really hit me here, it's like React is an awesome client side, whatever UI component framework. But we're never like the React apps we're building always need to write data back somewhere. So these server actions being included in the framework, or there's a path to them being included in the framework, I feel like it really acknowledges the type of apps we're building, and it feels awesome.
Totally,
I love
man.
that.
Totally. Tell me a little bit more about like the actual like experience you've had with it. So you are submitting forms from server components. Are you making client components to show pending indicators, like the use form status hook and all that stuff? Just talk a little bit about like what you've done with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that whenever I'm building a form, I want to like get data in the database, and so that's like my goal is to just get data in the database. If I don't have validation errors wired up because this stuff is super alpha and it doesn't work that well, I don't care. Like if I can submit that, so that I just want to start out there. I don't want to like give anyone any impression that this like is like, oh, you can just replace all your Rails code or your PHP code with this. So
setting the expectations here.
Yes, yeah.
It's new tech.
So the first thing I always do is I basically start with a server component. So I have a server component that fetches data from a database and then renders a lowercase f form. And then I create a server action, not inside that component, but inside the same file as the component. So I just have one server file with basically my component and my action. You pass in that action to your form tag, and then when you submit your form, your action will be called. And that is all a server component. And so there is no, I don't know the word to use, like there's no UI associated with it. When you click the submit button, the server action just fires, but there's no indication on the client that there's no indication on the client that like your function is running or your function submitted. So if like you type in a form and hit submit, like you get no feedback.
Yeah. But that's the starting point. So
that's a starting
you have
point.
the data reading and the data writing in a single file, and it works. You don't get the browser indicator like you would in like even if your server action redirects like back to the same place and revalidates the loader or whatever.
Yeah, I haven't done a redirect. I've done a bunch of like refreshing, but no
refreshing or
revalidating.
Yeah. But that's pretty cool that you can have like a full stack page that reads and writes data and can refresh the data in a single file. That's why React is so much fun to work on, because when you use state and you read from state and then you set state and the state re-renders, that's the best part about React. And now you can do it across like the network, basically.
Yeah, set state over the network.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and I will say, like, again, when you're prototyping, when you're just trying to get something shipped so you can actually get a feel for it, it's really fast to get to that point. Just a component that fetches from a database and a server action that writes to the database. So it's not a lot of code. Again, this is one of the things that I love about it.
I have a question before you get on to the next part.
Yep.
If you're in your server component, you have your loader, async server component loads data, and then the server action still needs the use server directive.
Yes.
Even if you're in a server component, can you like explain that?
So I think there are multiple ways you can use server. I think if you can mark a file as use server, and then any actions, any functions that you import that from that and pass to forms might get marked as server actions because the whole file has been marked as use server. But I haven't done that, so I'm not quite sure about that. The reason, so React, this is a feature of React. You can now pass a function to a form. So you do action, brace, function, close brace. When you submit the form, that function is going to receive form data, which is a JavaScript class that basically represents all the inputs in a form. That function is not, like, there's nothing about the server in this. So that function.
So if you didn't have use server, you could write client-side code there?
Yes, exactly. So this will be like your new
Interesting.
handle. This will be like your new handle submit. So you could write, so I can talk about like why you'd want to do this in a second, but this function is just invoked when the server is when the form is submitted.
Got you.
now a lot of times, like all this stuff
So you
I've been
don't get
seeing,
and you don't get the error like the way if you try to do on click equals function, you would get a compile time error that says you need a client component to do that. But this is different.
I don't know where the error checks come in with this. So
Mm-hmm.
I know if you have like a form that's a client component, you can use an action
Mm-hmm.
with it, and that action will execute on the client. I'm not sure
Mm-hmm.
if
Your form is in your server component. You pass
yeah,
action.
yeah. And again, this is the stuff where like I don't worry about. Like in my mind, this is like all alpha.
Their
It's all going
problem,
to
not your
change. Yeah,
problem.
exactly. My like
Yeah.
I'm in very much like developer, make it work.
Right.
See like try to get a feel for what like the future is, but I don't worry about like the the rules so much.
Right. Right.
So anyway, you have a function that can execute. Let's just say on the client, but we want to run this function on the server to get data back into our database or whatever. And so now you mark the function with useServer, and that tells your framework, which in this case is Next, that tells Next that basically this thing is going to turn into an API route. So it's like, how would you describe this? You'd say like an implicit API route.
Mm-hmm.
There's like
Mm-hmm.
the build tool can make an API route for your function, and so now when your form gets submitted, which is it's pretty cool that if the whole idea with an action is when you submit a form, the action gets form data. Well, form data works in both Node and in
That is
browser
awesome.
JavaScript. So it should be like, if you think about it, it's kind of like a seamless, you can move functions. Since the objects work in both environments, you should be able to move the functions across both environments. Now, obviously, you're not going to be like running Prisma in the browser. I'm sure someone is, but that's not like your mental model of where Prisma runs.
Yeah.
But it's nice that you have this action prop that receives form data. So yeah, you mark your function as a use server to run it on the server. There's been a few times where I've wanted to introduce the client side state, client side feedback, like my form is
Mm-hmm.
submitting, or here's one like after my form submits, I want to close a modal. Like I pop
Mm-hmm.
open a modal, let you edit something, you submit it, run the code, and then, fade away the modal. So in that case, I have a client component that's a form, and that form has an action on it, but that action is a function that comes
It's
from
not a
that
server
component.
action.
Exactly. So that like client component as a prop will take a server action called like run code on server,
Right.
and then its action will be like await run code on server, and then set state modal is closed true
Mm-hmm.
to close the
Mm-hmm.
modal. So that's how you start to like start.
Interleave the server code with the client side interactivity.
Exactly. And then the next thing is
That's cool.
and I think this is really cool. React has its like unstable form status function. You're in a good spot when you're using functions from React that start with
Like we said, people side
unstable.
projects.
Yeah.
Side projects.
So form status is going to give you back the status of a form that's running an action. And so while that action is running, let's say on the server, the form status, it returns an object, and one of the properties of that object is pending, and pending will be true. And so you can take any client component, insert it into a form, and when the form is submitting, that client component is going to be reactive, and its little pending prop is going to flip to true, and then you can use that to build whatever UI you want, like a little loading spinner. I have a thing where I use Framer Motion to like slide out a loading spinner on my submit button. The thing I love about this though is to get this working, it doesn't need any knowledge of your server action. Like you as a developer, you could drop this into any form. Like you don't have to go into, like think about React when you work on forms, you have to like go into your handle submit and you do something like set is loading true is the very first line, and then you have like some try catch, and then you have some cleanup at the end. Maybe set is loading to false, and then you start passing that is loading down through your form tree to show spinners or disable inputs or whatever you're going to do with it. But with this, you just anything anywhere inside your form can use form status and get access to that pending state, and there's no modification to your action. So it's really cool that you get your action working. You're writing data to the database, you have no feedback, and now you're like, okay, well, what do I want to do? And then you can start to go into like client component land and build out the UI, but your action's already written. You don't ever have to think about that again. You don't think about, oh yeah, because I want to build this UI, I need to like, I change the way my data gets written. So I found that kind of like mind blowing that these two things are disconnected.
That's amazing. I'm trying to think how I mean, you could build this on your own, like in client side React. But again, to your point, people never really did because the integration wasn't there and there was too much flexibility, right?
Well, I don't know if you could build this on your own. You'd always have to go up to like your forms on submit function and start setting
Right.
state in there.
Maybe you could do something where if you, and maybe the Formic and the useForm libraries have something like this,
Oh,
useForm state or
they,
something like that.
they absolutely, yeah, they do.
But you have to integrate with them and you can't just go to, people have to be using those particular APIs. So everyone in the app would have to do that. But what you just said, that you could have a submit button component, right? It's a submit button and it renders a button from your UI library, your design system, but it uses form status. And I guess it just finds the form state from its nearest like ancestor form, like whatever its form it's part of. And then it can trigger its loading UI for that. And that is amazing. That composition story is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not like, to be clear, I'm not saying that like these APIs are like better than React Hook Form or Formic or anything. It's just interesting how it works and yeah, how you get to like write your action, get that working, and then go
Right.
and decorate your UI. I'm not saying like, oh, this is the only way to write forms or this is like the new
No,
way to write
definitely. No, no, no.
forms.
I
So
think the point, at least my takeaway from what you're saying is, it's like the equivalent of trying to think of an analogy. You know, it's like middleware versus wrapping every like get server side props in like a higher order function that says with
yes.
auth, right?
Yeah.
It's closed to modification but open to extension, right? And so we've never had that at the layer of React before, where any React app that does a server action can now take your submit button and have it render a loading UI when it's being submitted. You never had that before
I
because
think
the submit button would have to have knowledge of which form library you're using, right?
exactly. So I think
So
that's one of the
yeah.
things. Like you and I, we always try to do this. Whenever we submit a form, we have a min delay on whatever
Mm-hmm.
loading state we're showing. So you have
Mm-hmm.
like really fast writes. You submit the form, and like everything just flashes for, you know,
Right. It goes like boop boop, you know.
yeah. And it's like, well, your users are always jarred by that. So we try to do something where like the writes, even if they happen quickly, they seem slow. So the loading spinner shows for a second. When you submit a form, it kind of, you know, just that solid confidence of,
Right. It
yes,
gives
we're
you
writing your data.
confidence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every time we do this, we're always playing with APIs of like, okay, we're gonna like wrap our submit handler with a function that sets
Right.
some state and keeps that state around. But like every single time, we always there's some knowledge that gets exposed somewhere. So
Yes.
like we have a special button that can hook in and know how long it's been submitting for. We have some, yeah, again, some knowledge of our on submit handler. With this, there's no knowledge. Like you could make I could just drop a little component into any form you have that just shows like that just pulses with like green if form status is pending. And
Right.
you don't have to, you can
Right.
just remove that component, you can add that component. You don't have to change anything about your
Right.
code. So I think that's
Yeah.
that's a cool thing, the disconnect between
Yep.
the UI state and then like what's happening on the server.
That's awesome. That's really cool, man. I can't wait to play more with it. Um, I'm working on a remix course right now for Build UI, and it already was so much more fun than the way we did things before with API routes or even with like client side writes because it just feels so rock solid and you just say, I need to write data. How do I do it? And the guides tell you this is how you do it. All of that feels great. And they even have, a lot of those ideas that are in React Server Components and actions now, like the form data object being in the server side action. That's there in Remix as well, which is great. But I'm excited to play more with it in the future for sure. I wonder, I wonder what the roadmap is for them becoming stable or them not being tied to Next. I know right now it's part of Next, not necessarily React, right? But they use like Action as a React feature.
Yeah, I'm not sure where exactly the boundary exists, but I know this is stuff that's I believe it's in React Canary that Next uses if when you opt into these server actions. Again, this is all alpha. The way my sort of view on this is, I know the code that I'm writing today is not like, I know this will change, right? I know
Right.
like the code I'm writing,
Right.
but I think the architecture will stay. So this idea that like you have a function that you pass to a form, when you submit the form, that function runs on the server. I'm expecting that mental model to stay around. Now,
Right.
how you get like validation errors or how
Refresh
you refresh it,
caches
yeah,
or
I'm expecting all that to change. So I don't really spend a lot of time trying to like nail those details when I'm working on this. By the way, like for the most part, like you can make an app, like you can make a toy app or like a personal project app with this tech, and it feels solid. So yeah,
Nice. That's awesome, man. Cool stuff. I'm looking forward to playing with it.
nice.
All right, why don't we wrap it up for this week? I'm working on some remix videos, like I said, for Build UI. You're working on server components. We got a new one coming out this week, so check out Build UI if you're interested in those. I had a YouTube video just come out. We're doing some work with the WorkOS folks on building a dialogue with Radix. Radix is such an awesome library. I think it's a really cool balance between the headless unstyled libraries, but it's still high level enough that it's really pleasant to use, but it has like a ton of components. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. It's part one that we just released is that I just put out is styling an unstyled Radix dialog with Tailwind CSS. And the next two parts will be adding like interactivity, animation, and then making it reusable. So you can check the show notes for links to all those.
Cool.
Awesome. All right. That's it for this week. Let's do it again next week. What do you say?
Yeah, how about it?
Sounds good. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll talk to you next week. Bye.
See ya.